Welcome back to another Explainer. Today we're diving into a literal historical horror story. I want you to picture this. It's 1519. Deep in central Mexico sits this massive floating metropolis that is vastly more magnificent than anything you'd find in Europe at the time. It is just teeming with wealth and power. But imagine knowing that in just 2 short years, this entire bustling utopia would be reduced to ash, completely wiped from the map in a blood-soaked apocalypse. Today, we're exploring the fall of Tenochtitlan, which is this deeply terrifying tale of alien arrivals, internal rot, and an invisible monster.
To really wrap your head around the sheer terror of this story, you have to look at the unbelievable odds. Just think about this number, 500. When the Spanish soldier Hernán Cortés landed on the Mexican coast back in 1519, he had just 500 men with him. Waiting for them inland, an empire of millions. The sheer audacity, and honestly the chilling reality of what was about to happen, makes this one of the most terrifying David versus Goliath setups in human history, just with a profoundly dark twist.
All right, let's dive into Act 1, the doomed utopia and the alien threat. So, to truly grasp the tragedy here, we first need to understand what was actually lost. Tenochtitlan wasn't just a city, it was this gleaming engineering marvel built directly on a lake, connected by all these intricate causeways and beautiful floating gardens. With roughly 200,000 residents, it completely dwarfed major European capitals at the time, like London or Paris. It was a thriving jewel of a city. The idea that something this massive, this well-established, could be utterly annihilated in the blink of an eye, it just feels completely unimaginable. But, right beneath that gleaming surface, a fatal flaw was festering. The empire was kind of rotting from the inside out. The emperor, Moctezuma II, demanded heavy, crushing tribute from neighboring peoples. And this wasn't just a tax paid in gold or crops. This included captives meant for human sacrifice. As you can imagine, this generated a deep, boiling resentment across central Mexico. The Aztec Empire was incredibly powerful, yes, but it was also universally hated, basically surrounded by neighbors who were just waiting for a spark to ignite a massive rebellion. And then, the absolute nightmare arrives from the sea. You have an Aztec world armed with obsidian blades and relying on a very fragile tribute system, suddenly coming face to face with a genuine alien threat. Cortés brought technology the Aztecs couldn't even comprehend. We're talking impenetrable steel armor, deafening cannons, and these massive beasts that they actually rode into battle. To the Aztecs, this was quite literally an invasion straight out of a horror movie.
But here's the thing, steel and horses alone, that's not going to conquer an empire of millions. Cortés's actual deadliest weapon was diplomacy. He managed to form an alliance with the Tlaxcalans, who were this powerful group holding deep, furious grudges against Tenochtitlan. Thousands of these vengeful indigenous warriors joined up with the Spanish. Almost overnight, Cortés's tiny little expedition mutated into a massive, terrifying army.
Which brings us to Act 2, the Trojan horse and the slaughter.
Fast forward to November 1519, and Cortés literally marches straight into Tenochtitlan. Now, historians still debate exactly why Moctezuma agreed to meet him and let him in, but the result was absolutely chilling. Cortés took the emperor hostage right inside his own palace. Just imagine the paralyzing terror for the citizens. Their divine, supposedly untouchable ruler was suddenly a captive puppet. The alien invaders had essentially become a parasite, quietly ruling this magnificent city from the inside out.
So now the tension is a total powder keg, right? And in 1520, it finally ignites. Spanish soldiers commit a horrifying massacre, slaughtering unarmed Aztec nobles during a sacred religious festival. In response to that, the entire city just erupts in a blood-soaked rebellion. Moctezuma was actually sent out to try and calm the masses, but he was struck down and killed by his own furious people. The puppet strings just completely snapped and the city descended into utter carnage.
Suddenly, the Spanish are the ones trapped. They're stuck in this labyrinth of a floating city surrounded by hundreds of thousands of furious citizens, so they attempt a frantic, desperate escape under the cover of darkness. This terrifying retreat is forever burned into history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows.
But of course, the Aztecs were waiting for them. Warriors swarmed the pitch-black causeways, unleashing an absolute slaughter. And what's incredibly haunting about this specific night is that many of the Spanish soldiers were simply too greedy to leave their plundered Aztec gold behind. They were literally weighed down by their stolen treasure and were just swallowed alive by the dark waters of the lake.
And that leads us right into Act 3, the Invisible Monster.
Now, you might think the story ends there, but Cortez didn't just give up. He retreated, rebuilt his vengeful indigenous alliances, and returned in 1521. But this time, there were no palace politics. It was just a ruthless, suffocating strategy of total siege. Spanish ships completely blockaded the massive lake that completely severed the city's food and freshwater supply, while Allied warriors waged brutal ground warfare. Tenochtitlan was utterly trapped, being slowly, agonizingly choked to death.
When you break down the actual causes of the city's doom, you've got famine, you've got the Spanish cannons, and you have those brutal ground warriors. But none of those were the ultimate killer. Actually, half of the absolute devastation came from a weapon deadlier than starvation or steel. It was an invisible horror movie monster, smallpox.
Unknowingly carried across the ocean by the invaders, this biological nightmare just tore through a population that had absolutely zero immunity to it. As the city sat trapped in the dark by the siege, smallpox killed thousands upon thousands of people in agonizing ways. It did vastly more damage than swords ever could, and it even killed the new Aztec emperor. They were fighting a plague they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and definitely couldn't kill.
Finally, in August 1521, the end came. Weakened beyond measure by months of famine, relentless attacks, and that devastating epidemic, the great floating utopia of Tenochtitlan finally collapsed. That magnificent jewel of a city we saw at the beginning was utterly destroyed, and in its ashes, a new Spanish colony was built directly on top of the ruins. The bones of the old world literally formed the foundation for what we now know as Mexico City.
But the horror doesn't just neatly stop at the city borders, right? The fall of Tenochtitlan wasn't just a single military defeat. It was the bloody, catastrophic opening scene of a much larger nightmare. It sparked a chain reaction of disease and conquest that would go on to devastate indigenous populations across the entire hemisphere on a genuinely apocalyptic scale. It remains one of history's most brutal collisions between two worlds.
You know, we so often remember Hernan Cortez as this lone conqueror who somehow toppled a massive kingdom all by himself. But as we've seen in this explainer, the truth is far scarier. This was an empire brought down by its own internal rot and a devastating, invisible virus, just as much as by foreign swords. And I think it leaves us with a pretty chilling question. If a thriving, highly sophisticated empire of millions can be reduced to ash in just 2 short years from within, what unseen threats could collapse the empires of today? Think about that for a second. If you want more explainers diving into the dark events that truly changed history, make sure to subscribe. And hey, let me know in the comments which historical empire we should dissect next. See you next time.